This is July 13th, 2010 at 1:15 p.m. and we are interviewing Richard Walker in Voorheesville, New York. He resides in East Bern. He served in the United States Coast Guard from August 3rd, 1965 to August 1st, 1969. Kenneth and June Hunter are conducting this interview. Please tell us your full name and when and where you were born.
Richard L. Walker, born May 23rd, 1943 in Albany, New York at Albany Medical Center Hospital.
And what did you do before you entered the Coast Guard?
Well, just before I entered the Coast Guard in 1965, I was working as a store clerk at R.B. Wing and Son Contractor Supplies on Broadway in Albany. Prior to that, I had been going to college. My college career kind of ground to a halt when I decided to change my major at my junior year, and also realized that we couldn't afford to go on. So I told my parents that I was going to take a year off from school and work, because I had worked as a summer employee at Wings, and I would work there for about a year and then go back to college. Well, this was during the 1945 increase in activity in Vietnam. And I suddenly found that my options were not what I had planned. I found out that I was due to be called up by the draft board. So one day at lunchtime, I left RB Wing, told them I'd be back in a while, went over to what was known then as the old post office building on Broadway at the bottom of the State Street Hill. Went up to the Selective Service office to find out what my status actually was. I'll interject here that I have never been so nastily treated by a couple of little old ladies that are probably younger than I am now. They were absolutely nasty. But I did find out that I had about 3 weeks before I was going to be called up for active duty. Well, a lot of things had to happen right away quick, as they say. As a kid, I had always wanted to join the Navy. It's just something I always wanted to do. So I left the Selective Service office and went over to the Federal Post Office and Courthouse, which was then the main post office for Albany, and I went to the Navy recruiting office. Explained my situation and was nicely told that they had a waiting list that was so long that it would be 6 or 7 months before they would be able to put my name on it. I didn't have 6 or 7 months. The recruiter jokingly said, well, the Marines are always looking for somebody, and no, that was not where I was. I left the Navy recruiter and went back to the old post office building, because on the same floor with the Selective Service was the Air Force recruiter. So I decided I would try that. And he just shook his head when I walked in the door. He said he had no available slots for recruits. Right next door to him was the Coast Guard recruiter. I walked in there and got told the same thing. So at that point I figured, well, it looked like the draft board was going to get me. I walked out the door and went to the big curving grand staircase in that old post office building, headed back down to go back to work. And I heard a telephone ring, and this was like in July, so a lot of the doors were open because air conditioning wasn't a big thing at that time. And just as I was going out the door, the Coast Guard recruiter, who was a chief petty officer, he yells down from the second floor to me. He says, hey fella, come on back up here. So I went back up. He had just asked me to take a seat. He was talking on the phone very sincerely with somebody, and the conversation went something like this. Are you sure that's what you want to do? And whoever he was talking to apparently said yes. And he says, well, he says, okay, he says, because if I take your name off the list, he says, you're going to have a long wait to get back on. He hung up the phone and he said to me, 4 years, active duty, you leave the 1st of August, can you do it? And this is like 3 weeks away, you know, and I'm saying, huh? And he says, that guy didn't want to go, changed his mind. He says, technically, I'm supposed to move everybody on my waiting list up 1 notch. He says, but they all know what their schedule is. He says, I think you have a greater need. And with that, I said, yes, I will do it. Went back to work. Went back home after work, sat down at the supper table. My parents were, well, my mother was still working, but my father was retired at that point. And while we're sitting there having supper, I said to my parents, I said, oh, I have some news for you. And they said, what? And I said, in 3 weeks, I'm going in the Coast Guard. My mother dropped her fork. My father looked at me and said, what did you say? And I said, in 3 weeks, I'm going in the Coast Guard. And then I explained to them the whole event of the day. Well, you want to talk about upsetting people. I think I was the only one who could eat that night. Well, the 3rd of August came, and you know, I had my military physical, and I went to the recruiting office. My parents went with me, and got sworn in, and it was interesting. I was not quite done with the draft board yet. One of those delightful little old ladies came in and said to the chief, is Walker here? And he says, right there. She said, did you swear him in yet? He said, yeah, about 10 minutes ago. And with that, she looked at me and took a piece of paper out of her pocket, threw it at me, and she says, well, you beat us on that one, didn't you? And she stormed out the door, and there was my draft notice. Welcome to the Coast Guard. Went to Cape May, New Jersey that afternoon, and never been in Cape May, New Jersey. And the other fellow who was recruited in Albany and myself, we took Trailways bus to New York, changed buses, for the first of my numerous 5-hour bus rides from New York City to Cape May, New Jersey. By the time the bus left Atlantic City and was on the lower end of the trip, almost everybody on the bus was somebody going for boot camp. We pulled into Cape May, and it was something like 10 o'clock, 10:30 at night. And we're just sitting there, and we were told that there would be a bus from the training center to come and pick us up. Well, other buses came in from Philadelphia and like that, and more guys got off, and we're all standing there. Nobody really knows what to expect. There's a little bit of false bravado that was going on and everything, and finally this very decrepit, beat-up, old gray bus comes up. Stops. The guy gets out. He says, everybody for the training center, get on here. So we got on the bus. He waited a few more minutes, and apparently there was one more bus that may or may not have been due, but we drove to the training center. It was about midnight or a little after by the time we got there. We pulled up in front of a World War II vintage barracks, which was all lit up. And 2 guys dressed in khakis. Now you got to remember, at this time the Coast Guard was still wearing the Navy uniform with just the little Coast Guard shield on the sleeve. 2 guys in khakis came out, got on the bus, and I have never heard so many expletives run out of 2 guys' mouths in such a short length of time. It was a very emphatic way of telling us to shut up. And we were told to get off the bus and move and get in there and fall in where we were told and go, 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 go. And I won't go into all the details, but it was welcome to the Coast Guard. Boy, was it ever. And I think we finally got to go to bed at 4 o'clock at night. And we were rousted out for reveille at 4:45. And so began our training. It was just an experience that I don't know what to tell you. It was like the weather's been this past week. It was hazy, hot, humid. We were down there for about 12 weeks. And some of the interesting things that went with it, which today probably some people could be offended at, and maybe some people could laugh at. Our drill instructor was a very short, wide, black first-class petty officer, Harold Judkins, bosun's mate, first class. And he had 16 years in the Coast Guard. Now, we had 2 black recruits in our company. Companies at that time for the Coast Guard would usually total about 150 to 200 guys. And this was in the mid-60s. And as the training continued on and got more interesting and more intense, one of the black fellas started talking about civil rights. And much to everybody's surprise, the drill instructor got in his kid's face and with the usual bunch of expletives informed him that his civil rights ended when he came through the gate on the bus the first night. And since he thought he was special because he was African American, he was going to be treated special. So when everybody else was down for 25 push-ups, he'd be down for 50. This was just, you know, well, it was intense. Reveille would be at 4:45 in the morning, and you'd go till 10 o'clock at night. And everything imaginable went on between getting shots, indoctrination, getting uniforms, inspections, physical fitness, classroom training, small arms training, on and on and on and on. And there was no let up. There really wasn't any let up. Because part of what had happened was the Vietnam War was accelerating. The Coast Guard was taking in more recruits, and they had cut the training back from 12 actual weeks of training to 8. I said I was there almost 12 weeks. That's because you had to wait till you had enough guys to form a company. So a lot of the earlier training was either dropped or pushed into the time period. So there was just that much less free time. Boot camp finally ended in October, and I had not signed up for any advanced training, so I had to take whatever was available. In the early and mid-1965 into 66, the Coast Guard was receiving all the Navy's old icebreakers. The Navy had gotten out of the icebreaker business. The Coast Guard had some, and they were basically getting all of them. So what they were doing to crew these ships was that anybody who was not previously designated for some form of advanced training was being shipped off to one of these ex-Navy icebreakers to become part of the new crew. Well, okay. I was figuring, I knew where I was going. I was going to Boston to go aboard one of these new icebreakers. Or they weren't new, but they were to the Coast Guard. And they stopped 4 or 5 guys in front of me. They had enough out of that group. So they shipped me off to Groton, Connecticut, to what is now the Avery Point campus of the University of Connecticut, but was then the Coast Guard Training Center for advanced training, Class A schools. And I went there to be part of the base personnel. I was not there for training. So doing everything by the book, when my parents drove me over there, I reported in on a Saturday, afternoon and went into the headquarters building. The training center at Groton, Connecticut was a former estate of a millionaire who, I was told at one time, owned the old New Haven Railroad. So the headquarters was actually a real live Italian castle that had been brought over block by block in the 1800s and reassembled at the site. So I went in and went to the officer of the desk and did it just like we were trained to do. Seaman Apprentice Richard L. Walker, 359330, reporting aboard as ordered, sir. The chief boatswain's mate, who was the junior officer of the deck, looked up at me and he said, cut out the crap. That's not what he said, but cut out the crap, kid. You're not in boot camp anymore. Oh, all right. Monday morning came, and there was probably about a dozen of us had reported in that weekend. Some for training, some to be assigned to the training center. And however it was, when I went into the personnel office Monday morning to report in for check-in and all of that kind of stuff, I was told that I had a choice. I could either work in the mess hall or I could work at the paint locker. Somehow or other, the paint locker didn't sound like the kind of thing that I was really interested in doing. So I said, I'll take the mess hall. And it was probably a smart move, because I found out within 2 days that I was going to become the Jack of the Dust, which is an old Navy term for the storekeeper for the mess hall. And it was either that or become a cook, but they had enough cooks at the time. So that was the beginning of my Coast Guard career. Groton was a fairly timid place compared to boot camp. I was able to make E-3, Seaman First Class, as they used to call it, Seaman. Then I was encouraged to take out my correspondence course and start studying to become a petty officer, which was storekeeper. It was good duty for a junior enlisted man working in the mess hall, because if you worked at the mess hall, you didn't get dirty. The guys who were the mess cooks, as they called them, this would have been anybody who was unassigned or guys awaiting a training class to start, would be sent to the mess hall, and they got to do all the good stuff. Clean up the galley, run the scullery, clean out the grease traps, haul out the garbage. But if you were assigned to the mess hall as part of the mess hall crew, you didn't do any of that stuff. You got to do your job, and that was it. After 18 months, give or take, I was informed that I had passed my examination to become a third-class petty officer. And because there was no billet at the mess hall for a third-class storekeeper, I was told that I was going to have to go over to the supply office. Okay, so when I was officially promoted, instead of wearing my chambray shirt and dungarees like I had been for 18 months, I suddenly had to be in what was affectionately known as the uniform of the day. Undress whites in the summertime and undress blues in the wintertime. I reported over to the supply office, and the chief in charge of the supply office was a Master Chief Storekeeper, another African American. And career Coast Guard, 20 plus years on active duty. The man had to have had a photographic mind. The man wouldn't use an expletive if his life depended on it. But if there was one thing he expected you to work. There was no excuse not to. So when I reported in to him, a little less formal, but I went over to the supply office, and I knew him by name. I said, Chief Melanson, Storekeeper 3rd Class Walker, reporting to the supply office as directed. And he was the first person I ever saw that had half glasses. Man, he only needed the bifocal. And he looked up over the top of those half glasses and he said, Walker, you just made 3rd class. 2nd class is an open rate. You can make it in 6 months. If you don't make it in 6 months, I'll personally have you transferred to the 1st Weather Patrol ship looking for a storekeeper. That was motivation. At the time, this is in the age before weather satellites. At the time, the Coast Guard had about 20 weather patrol ships that would cruise in certain designated areas in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, maintaining weather observations, also search and rescue, and providing weather information to the transatlantic and trans-Pacific airlines. It could be interesting duty, but if it was March in the North Atlantic with 40-foot seas, you stayed out there on your station. Maybe you didn't eat, maybe you couldn't eat, but the ship stayed on station. So this was not something that I was particularly interested in doing. So I was highly motivated to study to become a 2nd class. Example of Chief Melanson's abilities, I was assigned to the desk to type up what were called term contracts for the training center. This included everything from milk delivery to laundry service and things like that. And these were contracts that were made with civilian vendors. And I had a question one day about something on a term contract. And I went over to the chief and I said, Chief, what do I do about this particular matter? And he says, well, if you take a look in the comptroller's manual, which actually wasn't a manual, it was a series of loose leaf folders about 3 inches thick. If you take a look in the comptroller's manual, volume so-and-so, section so-and-so, blah, 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 right down to subparagraph, you'll find that it says. And I said, oh, okay, thank you, Chief. And he says, well, go look it up. All right, so I went and looked it up, and this is where I felt that Chief Melanson was above average. Everything he told me was word for word out of that book, just the way I found. He had that whole set of supply regulations memorized. And every time a change would come out, he also designated me to be the one to put the changes in the manual. And then he would tell me as I was working on it what the changes said. He would look at it, and that was it. He had it memorized, you know. Man was brilliant, really brilliant. And aside here, I've heard all kinds of nasty tales from fellow veterans of various services about the interracial stuff, especially in the 60s and into the 70s. I never had a personal problem with any kind of ethnic. We had not only African Americans, we had Puerto Ricans, we had Filipinos. I never had a problem with any of them. Got along with them all very well. Probably the only guys that you would have trouble with were the guys who were in for one enlistment and didn't want to stay. But all the people who were career types were absolutely great guys. Most of them develop kind of a toughness that when you're in an outfit like the Coast Guard, you become part of, you know, and it's part of you. But I never felt any kind of discrimination or anything like that. We closed up the training center in Groton in 1967. I had made 2nd class just before we closed it. Master Chief Melanson came in when he got there. He had ways of contacting people in headquarters. I don't know how it worked, but he did. He comes over to me one day and he says, Walker, you are going to be promoted. I said, I am, Chief? He says, yes. On such and such a date, you're going to be 2nd class. He says, do you know what you're supposed to do? I said, no, because it didn't happen when I made third class in the galley. He says, the day that's the effective date of your promotion, you will have a box of cigars on your desk, and you will provide a half keg of beer either at the Enlisted Men's Club or at the Chiefs Club, whichever one you pick. Oh. So when it came through and it was official, yeah, I complied with the tradition. It was all done. My most interesting experience actually in that office was one that now I look back at and I laugh. I didn't drink coffee. Drank milk, drank juice, did not drink coffee. But everybody in the supply office had to take turns making the coffee for the office. Now there was about 30 guys working in there. And they had one of these big, 30 plus cup coffee pots. And the standing routine, well, it was printed up on the wall right behind the coffee pot, but the standard routine was the end of, we'll just put together, my day would have been Tuesday, that for a particular week. So the end of the day on Monday, my job was to dump the grounds into the trash, rinse out the coffee pot, fill it with water, put the basket in, fill it with the prescribed amount of coffee grounds, cover it. That was all. Next morning, before anybody else was anywhere near the office, I was supposed to go over and plug it in, and then go across the parking lot to the mess hall and pick up the day's ration of donuts, rolls, whatever it was that they had for the supply office. Well, see, I didn't drink coffee. So when I dumped the old coffee out and dumped the grounds into the trash, I took a paper towel and cleaned the inside of that coffee urn out, because I said, there's some wretched looking garbage in the bottom of this thing. I mean, it was putrid. Sludge. So then the first time, right? So I made everything up. Next morning, went over, plugged it in, went over, got the donuts and everything. Well, probably the second or third time in my Coast Guard career that I heard expletives that were beyond comprehension, because I took all the taste out of the coffee by taking and wiping the sludge out of the urn. Now, you got to understand that I was not only dealing with a career E-9 Master Chief Storekeeper, I was dealing with a lieutenant commander, 3 warrant officers who were all 25 plus year guys, 2 other chief petty officers, and everybody else in that office, me being the only one who did not drink coffee. And I was cursed out for a week, because it took that long before the thing finally started to taste right. I learned how to make coffee. Well, getting back to my promotion to second class, when it happened, lunchtime came up, and Chief Melanson, who was a by-the-book guy, I mean, we would have our monthly base inspections, and he would get out there and he would nail guys for the littlest thing on their uniforms. It was almost like boot camp. He said there was no excuse for a Coast Guardsman not to look ready for inspection. So the day that I was promoted to second class, he stops by my desk and he leans over and he says, "Walker, I have an errand to run in New London. You're coming with me." "Okay, Chief." So I said, "Can I stop over and grab some lunch to take along?" He says, "Nope." He says, "We'll get lunch while we're over in New London." Oh, we got in his car and drove over to New London, and we went to an old steam railroad vintage hotel on the main drag, the main long hill coming down to the old New Haven Railroad station there in downtown New London. And we parked the car and got out. We went in. He talked to somebody. We went into the dining room. At this point, I thought this was a little strange. And we sat down, and he says, "Walker, I've liked your attitude ever since you've been in the office." He says, and you're the only guy that I've ever done this for. He says, lunch is on me, and if you want the lobster, order it. So for all of his by-the-bookism, you know, he was really a good guy, you know. Well, I was one of the last guys to leave the old Groton Training Center in '67 before we turned it over to the University of Connecticut. I was sent temporary duty to Governor's Island in New York because at the same time the Coast Guard had just taken over Governor's Island from the Army. And I was assigned to the pay office, which was pretty much of a fiasco in my Coast Guard career because I had never worked payroll. I kept telling them I had never worked payroll. They said, well, you can learn it while you're here. Well, that's a whole nother story, but I didn't make a lot of friends in the pay. But I knew I wasn't going to be there long. I was told, well, okay, you're going to Cape May, New Jersey. Right back where I'd been in boot camp, right? Going back to Cape May, New Jersey to what was known as Cape May Station, which is, well, another aspect of the Coast Guard life. So it was, I think in October of '67, I was sent down there for 90 days temporary duty. The long and the short of it was Cape May Station and Cape May Group was part of the search and rescue system. They had the lifeboats and the buoy tenders and all of this kind of real Coast Guard stuff. And I was being sent down there to fill in until a new storekeeper from Storekeeper School. That was the other option, and I didn't do it. I did it by on-the-job training, but until another storekeeper from Storekeeper School would be available. So I got down there on my 30 days temporary duty, or 90 days temporary duty, and found that the guy who had preceded me, the former storekeeper who had been discharged a few months before, had spent about 6 months not doing his job. Bills had not been paid. The search and rescue units were not able to buy materials locally that they needed. They were getting dunning letters from local businesses. They were getting nasty letters from the Coast Guard chain of command about all kinds of errors and stuff. And I was told I had to straighten it out. I thought this was weird, but okay. And we actually had a Cape May Lifeboat Station, Indian River, Delaware Lifeboat Station, Lewis, Delaware Lifeboat Station, Townsend Inlet Lifeboat Station, and a whole bunch of vessels. Search and rescue craft, lightships, lighthouses, all this stuff that today, you know, they some of the stuff they don't even have, and the lighthouses are all automated, but this was, you know, 45 years ago. So I was assigned 2 junior enlisted men to be my helpers, and we set about trying to straighten out the books. I got a phone call from a captain in Governor's Island at 3rd Coast Guard District Headquarters, who was actually my boss at this point. Though I was assigned at Cape May, I was responsible to this captain. That's the same as a full bird colonel in the other services. And he told me that in order to get bills paid, we were going to cut some corners and do some things that were a little contrary to regulations. He says they weren't going to get anybody court-martialed, but they certainly would get some people annoyed if they heard about it. But we wanted to reestablish the Coast Guard's good name in South Jersey. So we pulled a lot of bureaucratic shenanigans to get this done. So, and people started getting paid. Well, as my time at Cape May Station and Cape May Group came up to an end, I was asked by the commanding officer, who was a Mustang lieutenant commander.
What's a Mustang?
Yeah, Mustang is a commissioned officer who was an enlisted man and worked his way up through the ranks. Most of the time by going to officer candidate school or something like that. But Lieutenant Commander Briggs had been a quartermaster, petty officer. I believe he'd been up to first class. And I was called into the office, his office, and he said, "How'd you like to stay?" And I said, "Well, I hadn't thought about it, sir." He says, "Well," he says, "you've done a good job. We're satisfied with you." He says, "You seem to be fitting in well." He says, "How'd you like to stay here?" I said, "Well, yeah, okay, that sounds good." He says, "Well, type up a letter requesting a permanent transfer." I said, "Okay." So I went and did it. And the process is very bureaucratic. It has to start from the individual who signs it and passes it to his immediate supervisor, and it goes up through the chain of command. Then it can go all the way to where they have the power to transfer you. Or it can come back with a refuse for whatever reason, if they, for some reason or other, don't want to do it. So I typed it up and I gave it to my immediate superior, who was was a warrant officer. Warrant officers are tough guys. And he signed it, approved, forwarded, approved. I took it into Commander Briggs, and he says, "Oh, very good." He leans back, always remember this, leans back, opens the center drawer on his desk, takes out an envelope and says, "Here, read it and get rid of it." I said, "Yes, sir." I read it, and he says, "There's a copy of it in your service folder already." It was a letter from Coast Guard 3rd District Headquarters already saying that I had been permanently transferred to that unit. He says, "Well, it looks better if you request it than we turn around." I said, "Oh, I wasn't leaving anyway." The next part of my Coast Guard career was about to begin, because within a day, the executive officer, the second in command, comes in, another old salty sea dog, a W-4 warrant bosun, been a bosun's mate as an enlisted man, and now he was a warrant officer, 27 years in the Coast Guard. And he comes in and he says, "Hey, Keys." Now, that's a slang term for a storekeeper, because the insignia for a storekeeper is crossed keys. He says, "Hey, Keys, when was the last time you ran small boats?" And I said, "Well, when I was in boot camp, sir, about 2 years ago." And he says, "Well, okay." By this time it's like November. He says, "Get some foul weather gear, go down to the boathouse, see Chief Warren, and get out on the motor lifeboat and start running some drills." And I thought this was very strange, because all that temporary duty I was there and getting their finances all straightened out, I never had to stand watch. Well, that may sound cool, but I was working from 7 in the morning until 11 at night, 6 days a week. So I didn't have to stay on watch. I didn't have any life, So I said to him, "But sir, I'm a storekeeper out on a motor lifeboat." And again, the air went blue with expletives. These old guys had a vocabulary that a lot of people, well, maybe today would find it normal, but back 45 years ago didn't. And in the essence, if you remove all the expletives, was everybody at a lifeboat station is assigned to a motor lifeboat. Get down to the boathouse and learn how to operate it. So I grabbed some of what was then foul weather gear. It's not like this modern wetsuit stuff they have today, and I went down to the boathouse, and Chief Warren was standing there leaning against the door at the boathouse, and I knew he was waiting for me. He was Chief Bosun's mate. And I said, "Hi, Chief." He says, "Well, the new storekeeper is with us now." I said, "Yeah, Chief." He says, "Well, let's get in there and get to work on the boats." He says, "Uncle Bill," that's what they called the warrant officer. He says, "Uncle Bill called and said you were coming down." Well, as I turned to walk in, there was a sign, one of these fancy, what they called knot boards. The nautical knots are a great fascination. If you go to a lot of beach places, souvenir stuff, they have what they call knot boards. Well, we had guys who made real good ones, and they would be really decorated and shellacked and varnished and beautiful stuff. And they had one over the door going into the boathouse. And it said on it, besides all the fancy knots, very neatly carved into it and painted in gold, it said, "You have to go out, you don't have to come back." And I said, "What's that mean, Chief?" He says, "That's the motto of the old life-saving service." He says, which means just what it says. If the alarm goes off, you go out there, but if you die trying, doesn't mean you're coming back. I said, oh, what did I get myself into? The rest of my time at Cape May was spent being their storekeeper, not just for the Cape May station, but for the other units that were there. And fortunately for me, my boat crew duties was always the most mundane, boring, uninteresting things. We had 4 or 5 boats down there with 1 crew less than we had boats. And if we had to get that last boat underway, either the station yeoman, the personnel clerk, or myself was the guy who went along, and the rest of the boat crew was 2 of the old warrant officers. So you could see that we were out there with a bunch of salty sea dogs. All the guys at Cape May who did all the brave stuff, got all the notoriety, got all the commendations, and I don't envy this. No. But they were guys on the other boat crews. I got to go out and take emergency generators to lighthouses sitting in Delaware Bay, go out and do quarterly audits aboard the old lightships, making sure that they had all their supply records. And, it was all very mundane, but at the same time, if I was assigned to a boat, I had to know what to do. It was the way it was. We had an interesting relationship with the training center, the recruit training center, because we were literally right next door to them. We lived in their barracks, we ate in their mess hall, and the lifeboat station was just outside the recruit compound. And because it was the recruit compound, everybody was supposed to be perfect example for these impressionable young kids that we were 2 years before, But at the lifeboat station, you didn't have any time for that. So one day we had, we had, lifeboat stations are what they are, and we had a tragedy in Delaware Bay. A small privately owned boat, probably a fishing boat, went missing. Eventually they found the boat, and then we had to look for the bodies. So the guys were out in Delaware Bay for, I think it was almost 48 hours. And they were just looking all the areas, any reports that they got from people out in the bay. And we had to relieve the boat crew. So one of my jobs actually was what they called the duty driver. So I was told to get a relief boat crew, drive 40 or 50 miles up along the shore of Delaware Bay, up past, I think it was Bridgeton, or in that area, up past there, to a little fishing village called Fortescue, which, if my memory serves correctly, was a dry community. Okay. And I had to take the relief boat crew up there and get the guys who'd been underway all this time and bring them back. So we did this, switched boat crews, brought them back, and the guys who'd been relieved had, 2 days growth of beard, they were dirty, they were, it was what it was. Motor lifeboats are a semi-open vessel. And they hadn't eaten a good meal in days. So when I came back into the training center with the vehicle, I was told to take them directly to the base mess hall so they could get some food. So I took them over there, dropped them off, and they didn't even get in the door. The master-at-arms at the base mess hall turned around and said they weren't in the uniform of the day and they couldn't come in there. They were not setting a good example for the recruits. So we took them back over to the station office, and the W4 bosun, Bill Bart was his name, W.C. Bart. We went in and I told him what had happened at the mess hall. he was, you know, one of the guys with the expletives in his language. He called up the training center commanding officer, who was a captain, four-striper. Knew him first name to first name. Told him what had just happened about these three guys had been without food or sleep for almost 2 full days. And he said he was going to send them back over to the mess hall and they better get fed. Images for recruits are not, these guys needed their food. And if the captain didn't like it, Uncle Bill was going to go over and discuss it with him. I took them back over, and it's amazing, you know, took them back over, and I went with them up to the mess hall. And the master at arms in the mess hall says, "Boy, you guys sure played dirty." He had apparently gotten a phone call from the captain to make sure that the guys came in. Well, they didn't take them into the mess hall. They took them to the Holy of Holies in the mess hall. They took the three of them down to the chief's mess, which was a separate place. Took them in there, and they had the mess cooks waiting on them to bring them anything they wanted that was available. And Mr. Bart said to me, he says, "Someday those people at the training center are going to remember what the real Coast Guard is all about." That went until 1969. I would come home about every third weekend. I like trains and I hate buses. And that bus ride from Cape May to New York City was 5 hours. The bus ran local from Cape May to Atlantic City. I should say from Cape May to Atlantic City, it ran local. And then from Atlantic City to New York City, that was the 5 hours. It ran express. And by the time you got up there, and this was in the days when they were still running intercity buses that didn't have toilets in them. So they would have to make rest stops sometimes on the Garden State Parkway for people who had to answer the call of nature. I would get into the Port Authority bus terminal and had enough of riding buses. I would take the subway over to Grand Central and I would get the train home. And that made the rest of the trip a lot more pleasant. And I am a train enthusiast. I've always been a train enthusiast. So just the whole idea of riding for over 8 hours in a cramped bus just didn't do it. But the 1st of August, 1969, I was finally discharged from active duty. And came home. Took about a month off. And I still had 2 years of a military obligation to fulfill. It was a 6-year enlistment, but I had 4 years on active duty, so I had 2 years in the inactive reserves, which didn't mean much of anything, actually, because it was total inactive. As my time in the inactive reserve drew to an end, I was asked if I would consider coming into the active reserves. And at that point, I became part of the Albany Reserve Unit. And I was in that, working out of both the old post office and courthouse, downtown Albany, and then the Leo O'Brien building, and then the Coast Guard station down in the port, at the captain of the port facility down there. They had a small active duty contingent with a large reserve contingent that assisted them. And the thing that made the active reserves more palatable than when I had been on active duty was that in the very early 70s, the Coast Guard, I found out, took the initiative on what to do with reservists, and that was to get them out of the reserve center and get them to do something besides sitting around watching training films. So if you were a storekeeper, you had to work as a storekeeper. If you were a bosun's mate, you had to work as a bosun's mate. There was none of this watching training films and drinking coffee and telling sea stories. So that sounded interesting to me. So I did that until 1981, I had made first class petty officer by this time in the reserves. And 1981, a couple of things happened. President Reagan cut the Coast Guard's budget for whatever reason. I've never been able to figure out why any president cuts the Coast Guard's budget. President Obama claimed he was going to do it. Whether or not he did do it, I don't know. I was told that he did. President Clinton did. President Reagan did. Whatever reason they cut the Coast Guard's budget for, I don't know. An aside on that, the Coast Guard's motto is Semper Paratus, which is loosely translated always ready. And historically, they have said all it means is you do more with less. And the standing joke is, and the fact that the Coast Guard does more with less just makes the politicians think that they can keep cutting it further. But that's my editorial comment. But when I was in the active reserves in 81, I developed a minor heart problem. And I was immediately put on inactive status. I called a friend of mine whom I had been on active duty with, who was working as a civilian for the Coast Guard headquarters. Told him that I'd been put on inactive status, and I said, "What's going on?" He says, "Well," he says, "you know, the president cut the Coast Guard's budget. They're looking for any reason that they can to get you out." He said, "So what they're going to do," he says, "they're going to let your enlistment expire on inactive status. Then they're going to tell you if you want to re-enlist, you got to go for a medical board of approval, not just a physical." He says, "and then they're going to tell you, oh, you're not fit to re-enlist," and he says, "and you're out." He says, "and by doing it this way, the government is free of anything that resembles a disability pension." Guess what they did? Just what my buddy told me they were going to do. So after 16 years, I was out. And I had a fit of temper, and instead of going to the National Guard or somebody like that and doing my last 4 years, I just said, to heck with it. Then I found out years later that, in fact, if I had been patient, about 10 years later, I could have appealed it, and at that point they were desperate for bodies again, and they would have taken me back in for the last 4. But I didn't do it, so. But that's my personal Coast Guard career. It's like I said, my active duty time was very mundane. It was very ordinary, but I learned an awful lot of things from watching the fellows, especially the guys at the lifeboat station. I have always identified, even though that was only 2 years of my total time in the Coast Guard, but I've always identified as a lifeboat sailor. Because even though I was a storekeeper, it did give me something to identify with. The fact that I was ready to go out in a motor lifeboat if I had to. The first time they sent me out in one was in a storm. It was a routine thing, but it was delivering equipment to an offshore lighthouse. We couldn't get to the lighthouse. And we were in one of the old 36-foot motor lifeboats. There were have what they call a turtleback on. And I was lashed in with a harness. And I said to the guys, I said, "Well, what are you doing this for?" And they said, "Well, when the boat flips over, we don't want you to go out." I said, "What do you mean when the boat flips over?" Right? Not knowing that these boats were designed just to do that, to roll over and come back up. Well, we're going out in this storm, and I'm hanging on to the towing bit in the stern of the boat, screaming my fool head off about, we're going to do. I mean, the water's coming over the sides of the boat. We're all soaked. And the other 3 guys in the boat, because I was the one delivering the equipment. The other 3 guys in the boat were laughing like crazy. I mean, And when we got back into Cape May after our unsuccessful attempt, one of the guys says, "Well, you're probably going to have to go put on clean shorts." It wasn't quite that bad, but I understood what he was talking about.
Now, after you left the Coast Guard, I know you've done some volunteer work. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. In 1998, we found out that the USS Slater, a destroyer escort from World War II, was brought to Albany to be put on display. My wife and I went down and took a look at it, and were invited to join as volunteers. And I took a lot of teasing about being a shallow water sailor going down to play on a real ship. I was told that I had to stay on the pier side of the ship because the water was shallower there. But the reality was I found out that during World War II, 30 of the Navy's destroyer escorts actually had 100% Coast Guard crews. And went out in some very deep water and did some very big things during the Second World War. And it became an important thing for me, not really because of the Coast Guard aspect of it, but because a lot of the Slater volunteers at the time were guys who were not that much younger than my father. And my father and I had a very close relationship. And when he passed away at age 91 and a half, I really missed him. So it was like these guys were all substitute fathers for me. I could get down there and be around a bunch of guys like him. But I got to meet a lot of great people, and I like being a tour guide when they have school kids on board the ship. And I'm the ship storekeeper. I'm working my rate just like I did when I was on active duty. So.
And don't you also work with
The Maritime Ministry.
That's the one.
Yeah, that's kind of collateral duty. The port chaplain visited the Slater a couple of times to do memorial services, and he asked me why I didn't help him at the Seafarers mission down in the port. I didn't know anything about it. And he says, well, come on down. He says, I'll show you all about it. And that's another long story, but yeah, I got involved in it. So we go aboard ships, minister to the merchant seamen as mostly a ministry of hospitality and welcome. We don't get too much theology in there unless they want it, but it's to let these mostly foreign guys know that they are welcome here, and we try to make their life as easy as we can.
Well, on that note, we'll say thank you very much for your service to our country.
Thank you for inviting me for this.